Hello and welcome back to Arts of Hermes. This is the second part of our video on magic and esotericism in the works of Alan Moore, and we're going to more or less just pick up right where we left off with the first part. So if you've not yet seen that, I definitely recommend that you watch that first, and you can find a link to that in the description below. So before we exactly pick up where we left off, I just wanted to offer a couple of follow-up comments to a few things that I said in the first part of the video. First, I just wanted to make clear the connection that I was intending to draw between some of what I was praising in Swamp Thing and its imaginative exploration of plant consciousness and some of the critiques that I had of the ontology presented in later works like the Moon and Serpent Bumper Book of Magic, and my criticisms of that anthropocentric and Cartesian worldview. That sense that the two realms of the physical and the mental, or matter and spirit, whatever, only really meet and touch inside of the human mind. I think that recognition of animal intelligence and self-awareness and animal communication certainly goes a way towards challenging that. But I think there's something even more radical in some of the work that's become very prominent in the last 10, 15 years about plant cognition and intelligence and fungal cognition as well. And I think that, that potential is really there in Swamp Thing, and it's unfortunate that it's not followed up in the Moon and Serpent bumper book, because I think that recognition would really, challenge some of the limitations there, and I think would at least potentially open up into a much richer and more powerful view of magic and its relationship to the world. Maybe it's also worth noting, if I didn't make that clear in the first part, that I think there's also something really special in Swamp Thing's exploration of what in that comic is called the green, that kind of vegetal astral realm or sort of Gaian mind that Swamp Thing is able to enter, in that sense that all of the vegetal life on the planet, I think now we would really want to add fungal life as well, is all sort of interconnected, which I think really resonates with a lot of contemporary research on mycelial networks and their role in connecting up forests and ecosystems into these vast webs of communication and relationship. Let's see. I also just wanted to follow up a little bit on I mentioned Moore's philosophy of eternalism, the idea that all times, all things that ever exist in eternity, for eternity, and that from like a sort of fifth dimensional perspective, the entire universe would appear as a four-dimensional crystal, with like the Big Bang at one end and then whatever the end of the universe at the other end, and that we exist as time-extended beings, with our birth at one end and death at the other, but that each one of those moments, each part of our life always exists eternally. I think that there are I think that sense that there is a perspective outside of time and that time isn't ultimate is certainly something that I'm definitely on board with. I think that it can go too far, and that it can emphasize like the static and the fixed, and that each thing is simply what it is forever, and that it doesn't allow for the possibilities of transformation, or it tends to interfere with the perception of the possibilities of transformation and relationship as well. In I think Carlo Rovelli's work, his book The Order of Time, and his, although he's absolutely a materialist, his sense of his metaphysics built on relationship, I think is really powerful, that show that things are only what they are, even at a quantum level, because they form certain types of relationship rather than each thing just being what it is, statically and eternally, I think is very powerful. And he also has some arguments there against that eternalist worldview, coming out of some of the more recent results in quantum physics. And he challenges that. There's a story that Alan Moore likes to repeat about a letter that Albert Einstein sent to the widow of one of Einstein's recently deceased colleagues, saying that, attempting to comfort her, and saying that, that death is only an illusion, that, all times exist eternally, and that nothing is ever really lost. And Ravelli, questions whether that we should take that as a genuine statement of what Einstein really believes, rather than him just trying to offer, some comfort and solace to a non-scientist. I just think that balancing out that eternalism with a recognition of, what in kind of Buddhist terminology would be like impermanence and dependent arising, and I think the magical and even sort of alchemical sense of the possibilities of change and transformation is important. And then finally, before we move on here, I just wanted to mention that this is actually something I hadn't even thought of until this morning, that I think another way that we could challenge some of that dualistic ontology, or something that could serve as kind of a wedge, for challenging some of that ontology, would be scientific, empirical study of psi phenomena, things like telepathy and precognition, maybe especially. That whereas in like the Moon and Serpent book especially, they draw this hard distinction between, science, which sort of deals with the realm of the physical and the material, and then art and magic especially, that deal with, the immaterial realm, the realm of imagination and mind and consciousness. I think that empirical research, and which, there's some pretty solid results out there about the reality of precognition and telepathy, and I think that challenges a bit of that separation that science has, it's one domain, and then art and magic have another domain. I think there are lots of places where that distinction falls apart, and I think that psi research, because they give so much space and importance to science and empirical research, I think that the fact that science and empirical research actually can touch on some of what we normally consider to be magical phenomena, I think that there's a lot of power and potential there. All right, so let's just move on here. So after all of the long preamble and general concepts and ideas and things like that from the first part, I want to jump back to the early 90s and the really beginning of Moore's exploration of magic and art and making magical art, which really starts with a series of performance pieces where he writes spoken word texts accompanied by music, mostly played by Tim Perkins, although we have David J., who's a member of Bauhaus, who also appears on some of the recordings as well. And these were done as not just sort of spoken word musical performances, but included lights and some theatrical elements as well. I know at least one of the performances had a fire breather doing her act on stage with them. So they were really intended as this kind of multimedia sort of performance event, in a way of bringing magical consciousness and ritual into a performance space, which, as I think we mentioned in the first part, Moore later recognized as related to Alexander's performance with Glykon, as well as I know he makes some connections to some things that, like some sets that John Dee designed as well. So I think that's an interesting line of thought, this connection between these kind of multimedia sort of performance spectacles and magic and ritual. So anyways, I don't have a ton, I think, especially in the interest of time, I'm not going to make a ton of comments about these spoken word performances. The performances themselves, and there's more than just these three. There's a few others. All of them are really interesting, and I definitely recommend listening to them. I think the actual CDs are out of print and probably pretty difficult to find, maybe expensive, but you can definitely find them online if you want to hear them. So in these performances, there's a lot of psychogeography involved. They were designed and conceived as very site-specific and date-specific. So we not only have a psychogeographic exploration of the actual place that the performance took place, and the surrounding area and its history and different resonances and connections, and often often a cultural sort of people, like discussion of William Blake and a number of others. Arthur Machen shows up in some of the performances of people who lived in that area or had connections to that area, and some of their ideas. And also the specific times and places during, I think it was Snakes and Ladders, if I'm remembering correctly, the cover that we see in the middle there. The night that performance took place, a comet crashed into Jupiter. And so that event of a comet impacting Jupiter is actually incorporated into the spoken word piece, which I think is an interesting dimension to them, that they were designed to occur at this very particular moment in time, and that from that specific place, we move into more and more abstract realms of thought, which I think is an interesting connection to the journey, like up the tree of life that we'll see in Promethea, which we're about to start talking about. And then you get again in the Moon and Serpent Bumper Book of Magic, of moving from the material to increasingly abstract and distant mental realms, of using psychogeography for that exploration, starting at the exact place and time that we find ourselves now, and then moving into the history and connections to a given place, and then from there being able to slowly move outward into increasingly abstract realms. So I think that's something to listen for in some of these performances. I think especially the Moon and the cover that you see on the left, the Moon and Serpent, Grand Egyptian Theater of Marvels, and then Snakes and Ladders. We really see that movement from the material place and time outward into really magical and cosmic realms of consciousness. Maybe a little less connected to some of the themes that we've been talking about here. The one we see on the right, Angel Passage, which is a performance piece largely about William Blake. As we said, Blake is a really important reference point for Moore's thinking about the imagination, but a little less connected to the specifics of ceremonial magic that we've been talking about here. But included here, I think the cover art, this is John Coulthard again, who did the design for the Moon and Serpent Bumper Book of Magic. It's a really great psychedelic angel on the cover here. And I also was thinking that the art style here, I think, really nicely reflects what is obviously Moore's both magical and psychedelic sense of aesthetics, where you get not only these sort of bright, fluorescent, sort of florid colors, but also this real density and layering of images that seems to be important for his understanding of how to do sort of magic and convey magical ideas. And we definitely see this in throughout Promethea. There's a lot of really dense layering of ideas and words. I suppose we see that all the way throughout Moore's, even like in Watchmen, you get some of that same sort of like density and overlapping events and levels of reality. I mean, perhaps that's just something that he'd always been interested in, but we definitely see it in Promethea. All right, so Promethea is a comic series that ran from August of 1999 and then concluded in the spring of 2005. The comic takes place within the America's Best Comics sort of shared universe, similar to like whatever, the Marvel sort of shared universe where whoever, Spider-Man can encounter, the Hulk or the, Black Panther or whatever, because they all exist in the same universe. This America's Best Comics, which Moore was one of the sort of co-founders of the company, and I'm not actually familiar. I've never actually read any of the other comics within that universe, though a number of the figures from that comic show up throughout Promethea. So it's important, I think, that Promethea is set in a world where our superheroes are relatively normal, because the way that magic is portrayed is not something that's common in a lot of works of fiction, where magic is portrayed as functioning in a much more literal and kind of grand, flashy sort of way. But here, because the whole world is over the top in a way, I think the analogy sort of holds that magic is to that world sort of exactly as, or more or less exactly as magic is to our world. And so that kind of over the top, like very literal presentation of magic really makes sense because the whole world is like that. And I thought that was very effective. So there's it's taking place within this world of superheroes, and there's a lot of crossovers of other sort of storylines. And something I just learned recently is that the apocalypse event that we'll be talking about considerably within Promethea is an apocalypse that really happens for the entire shared universe and was the bringing of the entire America's Best Comics line and world to a close. I don't know the exact details of the story, but the comic or the publisher that was releasing it had been acquired by DC Comics that, as we mentioned, Moore had a long time feud with. And I think originally DC had said that they weren't going to interfere in the America's Best Comics productions, but eventually they did start to interfere. And so in a very, I think really showing the Mars, side of Moore's character, as we talked about, he decided to just end the war. He literally destroyed the world because, he couldn't have it, the way that he wanted it to be, which I don't mean as a criticism. I think DC were obviously in the wrong there, but there is something of I think that character that we see throughout his career and interactions with other people that I thought was a little bit amusing. So I don't know, that's just sort of an interesting background to the apocalyptic events of Promethea, but we're not going to focus on that. All right, so. So let's just talk about some of the general themes and ideas that we are introduced to in Promethea. So as I said, Promethea is a comic. We get a superhero storyline here. A young woman named Sophie Bangs is sort of becomes this superhero Promethea, and we'll talk a little bit about how that happens. But the comic really functions in a way as sort of half superhero narrative and half essentially treatise on ceremonial magic. And a lot of it is really designed to introduce readers to, Kabbalistic and magical concepts and worldviews, which I think people who just want to read an exciting kind of superhero narrative or the types of stories that Moore is famous for, were sometimes disappointed or frustrated by Promethea because you'll have whole long series of issues that feel, I think, to them like just digressions into lectures about magic. So it's important to realize what's happening there and what the intention is. One of the really big themes throughout Promethea is the idea of art and poetry as invocation, which is how Sophie, as well as the other people who have the other artists and writers who have preceded her, are able to transform into Promethea. Promethea is a living idea or a living narrative, and ultimately is revealed as something like the incarnation or personification of the human imagination itself and its ability to create stories and the really like world building, world founding nature of imagination and narrative, but through either creating art or in Sophie's case, it's writing poetry about Promethea. That's how she's able to make the transformation from her ordinary mortal self into her, the superhero form as Promethea. We see the themes of imagination and story as real and alive, which is a theme we've already been talking about with Moore. That really gets played out throughout the whole series and is, I think, really the main theme and arc of the whole thing. We get quite a bit of exploration of the Qabalah and the Tree of Life. In particular, like right in the middle of the series, we have 11 consecutive issues that are an exploration of one Sephiroth at a time of the entire Tree of Life. Also worth noting that the comic is 32 issues long, and 32 is one of the key numbers to the Tree of Life. There's the 10 main Sephiroth. There's also this 11th sort of pseudo Sephiroth or false Sephira that we'll talk about in a few minutes. But there's 10 primary Sephiroth plus the 22 paths that correspond to the Hebrew letters, as well as in the Hermetic Qabalah to the 22 trumps in the tarot deck. So that total number 32 represents, the entire tree and a complete map of the universe according to this system. So the series was very obviously plotted out all the way along. And I mean, you can tell that from the very first issue, the ending of the series is already more or less known. And I think that really allows some of that density that we were talking about, because the series is so tightly plotted, and all the themes and events and characters and everything like that are so densely interwoven. But yeah, even the number of issues in the series is magically, kabbalistically significant here. Let's see, we see the use of pentagrams, basically an incredibly abbreviated version of the lesser ritual, the pentagram, the sort of staple core ritual in the Golden Dawn and sort of post Golden Dawn tradition. We get some long lectures about the 4 elemental weapons, which is something we talked about in the first part of this video here. There's a bunch of stuff about that there. Let's see, we get introduced to the Goetia or Goetia, however you want to pronounce that. This sort of a system of Solomonic magic for invoking various demons, supposedly spirits from hell. They're used as kind of as antagonists, though they're ultimately revealed to not be evil or anything like that, but just aspects of reality and aspects of the. I think, again, going back to some of that conception of entities like angels, demons, and gods as parts of the human mind or the human character, which I think they're partially deriving from Aleister Crowley and some of Crowley's earlier works. He talks about the idea that all of the entities of the Goetia, was it 72 spirits, if I'm remembering correctly, within that system, just represent aspects or parts of the human mind or the human brain, which I think is a view that Crowley didn't exactly stick to. I think that didn't really play out in his experiences, but I know that has continued to be an influential idea, that he did say that when he was younger. Obviously, Crowley really imagined early on that he was going to be able to set magic on a really a fully scientific, empirical footing and make it a science just like all of the others, which obviously he was not successful in doing. Let's see, we also have quite a bit of exploration of the tarot. In particular, there's an entire issue entirely devoted to an exploration of the 22 of the major arcana, the 22 trumps of the tarot. That issue in particular is a really, I think, key example of that really dense layering where we have multiple narratives and events all occurring kind of simultaneously throughout the issue. I think it's an interesting idea and an interesting effect, though Moore uses the trumps in sequence, starting from the Fool and running to the universe. He uses that sequence as a way of telling the history of the universe, from the Big Bang all the way to the modern day, which I suppose is an interesting idea, though it's a very kind of not just idiosyncratic, but it doesn't really seem like a core idea within the tarot, and I think it's an odd choice to use that as a way of introducing readers to the tarot. I think it makes that idea, that kind of historical or narrative sequence of the tarot, it really overemphasizes it. There's also a lot of issues, I think, with the particular story that he tells. In particular, it's an extremely Eurocentric story that really centers developments in Europe and European consciousness and culture over the rest of the world. I think is a big problem. It also portrays a very linear sort of development of progress from early, quote unquote, primitive societies and consciousness to the modern day. That is also a big issue there. So it's an interesting idea, an interesting experiment, though the particular narrative that he tells there, I think, is fairly flawed. Let's see, we see quite a bit of sex magic, which gets combined with these sort of Indian or kind of pseudo Indian ideas of the Kundalini and the chakras or chakras, as a lot of Westerners pronounce it. That gets included in his presentation of the system. And then finally, we see a lot of references to Aleister Crowley, as well as to the Thelemic mythology, in particular the goddess Babylon and the beast and their relationship. That, if any of you are familiar with Thelema, I'm sure you are familiar with that idea, and we'll talk about it a little as we go through. Although, the presentation of the Kabbalah and magic is, I think, in many ways more oriented toward or rooted in the Golden Dawn rather than this Crowley's specific orientation. There are elements of Thelema and Thelemic ideas and mythology throughout Promethea. Let's see. So let's just keep moving on here. Okay, so this is from some excerpts from the first issue where we get some explanation of who Promethea is. So let's just read through this here. Let's see. There's an explanation being given by the woman who was the previous Promethea in the world to Sophie, the new Promethea. So she says, see, Promethea was a real little girl who lived in 5th century Roman Egypt. Her father was a Hermetic scholar, sort of like a magician. A Christian mob killed him, not uncommon back then, but the gods intervened, taking his daughter into their world of myth and fiction, the immateria. So the immateria, as we'll talk about, is the name of the world of imagination, similar in a lot of ways to ideas like the astral plane or the world of Yetzirah in Kabbalistic terms. So she was taken into the world of myth and fiction. Promethea became a living story, growing up in the realm that all dreams and stories come from. Sometimes she'd wander into the imagination of mortals. Some of them, taken over by this powerful living idea, even physically became Promethea, either them or loved ones that they projected her identity onto. And so throughout the comic series, we get exploration. We meet some of the previous Prometheas, people who incarnated Promethea, and we hear their stories and how they came into contact with her, and the effects, sometimes rather disastrous effects that had on their lives. Let's see, continuing on here, she says, see, anyone with imagination and enough enthusiasm for the character can bring her through from the immateria by thinking themselves or others into the role. So again, I think following on things we've already said, and the use of art and the imagination as the invocation of a real living idea, which in the world of superheroes serves to transform the individual mortal into this sort of demigoddess superhero Promethea. All right, so here we see two panels. On the left here, we have Sophie, who's just recently turned into Promethea, talking to her friend. And she says, now I can't explain this. You'll have to trust me. I've fused somehow with, I don't know, some kind of living story. I've become the character I was writing my term paper on. I'm Promethea. So Sophie had noticed that this character Promethea shows up in all these different stories, and was writing a research paper on that, which I think is interesting too, the way that gets incorporated into the narrative, that she notices that there's this character that occurs, or these narratives that occur across a number of fictional ideas, and that leads her into the realization that this is an actual living being that she can connect with, which, again, it's told in this over-the-top kind of superhero version, but I think we can see how that's a sort of metaphor for a real experience that Alan Moore and a number of other people have actually really had of coming to the conclusion that ideas are alive and extend, beyond or between, or however you want to put it, the minds of the individual artists or creators, and that the ideas themselves are have an agency. And that through the use of art and creativity, we can invoke those ideas into ourselves and even become taken over by them. Yeah, let's see. Okay, so then in the panel on the right, this is the previous Promethea who's been wounded and is dying here, but she's talking to Sophie, who's just become Promethea for the first time. So she says, I know just how this feels, what's in your head right now, everything, every moment like stained glass. It's all right now, and full of this heroic fire, as if all of existence was a light, which, I think is a nice description of magical as well as, perhaps psychedelic sort of states as well, and what that state of consciousness feels like. Again, told in this, very literal, over the top sort of version of transforming into a superhero, but trying to capture something of, that real experience of magic and I think that the psychedelic state as well. All right, so as we said, there is this realm called the immateria that in the comic, Sophie is able to very literally enter and explore, though this, is obviously a presentation of something that more obviously really genuinely believes in, that through the human imagination is able to enter realms that are not confined to the individual mind or the individual consciousness, but we are able to step outside of those things and encounter ideas and even possibly entities there that extend beyond the limits of the individual self. As Sophie, the new Promethea, begins to explore the immateria, she also eventually feels the need to study magic, which the other Prometheas, the earlier Prometheas, hadn't done. I think in some way we could, if we wanted to read this autobiographically, which there's always danger in doing that, but if we wanted to, I think becoming comfortable in the immateria and moving in the immateria was, Moore's experience of, becoming a writer and a creator, and becoming, comfortable operating in this abstract realm of ideas and getting some sense of how they worked and operated. But then, just like Promethea needs to understand what's happening and the deeper realms of the immateria, I think Moore, as he's talked about in interviews, wanted to really understand what exactly is going on with the imagination, and to be able to answer that kind of eternal question that artists and writers always get asked, by fans and things like that, of where do you get your ideas, where do ideas come from, and how do we experience that. I think that practicing magic and exploring, using the Tree of Life and the Kabbalistic system and the tarot as maps of this immaterial realm was a way of moving deeper into this and understanding it in a deeper way. So where the previous Prometheas had become comfortable in the immateria but never studied magic and Qabalah, Sophie now takes up the study of magic and the Qabalah in order to move deeper into the realms of the immateria than Promethea had previously journeyed. Let's see, also worth mentioning here, and I think this ties into some of as we mentioned in the first video, the idea that the concept of magic and the imagination and art and creativity is never unpolitical. We see in the primary antagonist of Promethea, a group known here as the Temple, who are a kind of version of evangelical Christianity, essentially, who in this version of the world or this narrative, they are more or less a continuous organization who extend all the way back to at least to the 5th century in Alexandria, which is what we see here on the screen. That's the figures approaching with the spears here in the top panel are the members of the temple, and the man we see there on the left is Promethea's father. On the right, that's the Promethea, the little mortal girl. Let's see, and so her father, who's I think what is described as a Hermetic scholar and a magician, he says, "Well then, there's nothing for it. They are coming for me as they came for beautiful Hypatia. Best go now, beloved daughter. All my love and all my gods shall be about thee as a mantle." Hypatia, of course, was a Platonist philosopher and mathematician, and she taught publicly and apparently was a really wonderful teacher. Not a lot of her ideas have really survived, but yeah, she was a pagan philosopher and mathematician, and as a woman teaching publicly, this was something of an outrage to some early Christians in the area, and she was eventually murdered by a Christian mob. So, Moore has taken that idea and transformed it into this idea that there was an actual organization behind that event called the Temple, who are, stamping out paganism and magic and the powers of the imagination. And they've now come for Promethea's father. So Promethea, the little mortal girl, then flees and encounters in the desert the gods Hermes and Thoth, who we'll see again in just a few minutes. And it's that sort of double god, Hermes Thoth, that affects her translation from a mortal girl into the immateria, where she becomes a living story. So back in the modern day, Sophie / Promethea becomes aware of the temple and the fact that they oppose her and are actually sending various entities out to attack and attempt to kill her, and so she finds their location and goes to confront them, but when she arrives there, she finds a children's birthday party in progress. So she's surprised to see a children's birthday party in progress here. So in the panel on the left, the guy who's the current leader of the temple, he says they are the temple's future witch, calling Promethea a witch, raised to guard the world from the coming apocalypse and from the horror clad in scarlet and gold who is its harbinger. Obviously, that's a reference to Promethea. This idea of the whore clad in scarlet and gold is also a reference to the Thelemic mythology of Babylon and the Scarlet Woman. There's a resonance that Moore brings in between Promethea and the goddess Babylon here. And they are aware, that Promethea is bringing the apocalypse, and that is her ultimate sort of goal and nature, which we'll continue to talk about as we go along here. Let's see. So then Promethea leaves here, but as she goes, she talks to the children and says, I'm going to show you something. I'm going to show you where I come from and what I stand for. Watch carefully now. And then on the next page, as she enters the immateria, she grants the children a vision of this immaterial world where, all these, fantasy beings, creatures from fairy tales and children's stories. We see Alice from Alice in Wonderland and the White Rabbit and the Mad Hatter there, and, a number of other fantasy figures there. And then in the panel on the right, the temple leader there says, "Don't look, children, don't look. They're things from hell." Which the children don't listen to, and Grandpa, you're spoiling it. And so I think there's something of the political and social and kind of religious or spiritual understanding here, that showing these children a vision of the sort of the splendors of the human imagination and its magical power is a way of counteracting the temple's influence, that the next generation of temple members are in some sense diverted from that path by being granted this vision of the immaterial. And yeah, we'll go on to see some of the repercussions of this. And I think this is also a nice example of how, even though Promethea, to an extent, is a classic superhero, modeled on the likes of Wonder Woman or whoever, she is also non-traditional in her relationship to violence, that although there are violent confrontations may occur or that she gets sort of caught up in, the solutions to problems are never violence. That as I think this really resonates with what we talked about in the first video about that adapting some of that David Graeber idea about the ontology of the imagination versus the ontology of violence, which I'm sure Moore wasn't actually consciously thinking of, but I think that it resonates very nicely, that as the essentially incarnation of the human imagination, she doesn't need to resort to violence, that there's always, things like communication and various forms of transformation are always the answer, and that even in her confrontation here with the temple, there's ultimately no violence that takes place. and the conversion or awakening of her enemies or their defeat in some other like imaginative fashion or transformative fashion is always the way that she solves or engages with problems. And I think that sort of plays out really nicely and is obviously a really striking contrast to a lot of traditional superhero like type narratives that really connects to her place as the incarnation of the human imagination and its powers to, as we've been talking about throughout this series, to transform situations rather than simply, giving in to the imposed like limitations that violence always represents. All right, so as we've said before, Sophie/Promethea feels the need to journey deeper into the realms of the immateria, which here is portrayed as the journey up the tree of life and through the various Sephiroth. Her specific motivation for doing this is to follow the departed soul of the previous Promethea, who herself is journeying into these realms to follow or to try to meet up with her late husband, who was a ceremonial magician himself and has begun to climb the tree. So they're following him essentially up the tree. So I don't know, it's maybe a slightly awkward sort of motivation for the journey, but it functions. So anyways, here in the panel that we see, Promethea is talking to, Promethea carries the caduceus, the emblem of Hermes, which, also functions as her magic wand, her implement here. And the two serpents that twine up the caduceus are portrayed as alive and able to speak and have conversations with her. So here she's conversing with them. And she says, I feel the need to take a long journey soon to find someone, a journey into magic. I've read a lot of books. I understand the ideas intellectually, I suppose, but I don't really feel them. I need to see more. So this, I think, obviously functions as, a real idea about the Qabalah and magic, that it's one thing to read books about them, but ultimately personal experience of these realms of existence is necessary, that there needs to be actual magical work done and actual experience gained rather than just like intellectual understanding of Kabbalistic or esoteric concepts. All right, so she is going to follow the Sephiroth up the tree of life in numerical order. The tree of life and its ordering and the identities of the different Sephiroth is a whole complex thing that we can absolutely talk about in a future series in depth. I mean, it's really been the core of most modern magic since the Victorian era, since the Golden Dawn. And although it has certain problems and issues and limitations, I think it still remains probably the core map and set of symbols for the modern Hermetic Western esoteric tradition, though I think that is starting to change now. But anyways, nevertheless, this is what the system that Moore is working with here. So in her journey, she will start at the 10th Sephira Malkuth, which we see at the bottom there, which, at least in this particular understanding of the Qabalah, is the physical world. And then she will journey up the paths that connect to the Sephiroth, following that. I've drawn little red arrows there, following the path that she'll take. So from the 10th to the 9th to the 8th to the 7th, and so on. Moore also works with this idea that between the upper 3 Sephiroth and the lower 7, so between in her journey, this will be moving from 4 to 3. She passes through the abyss, which is a really important idea in Aleister Crowley's understanding of the initiatory path, seen in, I think, most especially in his works like Vision and the Voice, which certainly has an influence on some aspects of this comic, and also the idea that there's another Sephira here called Da'ath, which is a sort of false Sephira, which in some understandings is something of an illusion or a place of trial and fear. In the Jewish Kabbalah, it was really not that, but it's sort of become this for a lot of contemporary, Hermetic, ceremonial, magical understandings of the Tree of Life. And so Moore is definitely following that model, and also drawing a little bit on the works of Kenneth Grant, or at least his understanding of Kenneth Grant for this. So we'll see a whole issue devoted to this crossing of the abyss and the false Sephira Da'ath, before she moves on into the supernal triad of 3, then 2, then finally culminating in Kether, the crown, Sephira number 1. And as I think I mentioned in the first part, only in reading the bumper book of magic recently was I struck by how much the colors attributed to the Tree of Life really influence Moore's understanding of these things. We see the colors really strongly, and each of the 11 issues that deal with this Sephira, the Sephiroth, in one by one, really use the Golden Dawn's color scales and the dominant colors associated with them, and each one also adopts a particular art style intended to correspond with that particular Sephira. So we're not just journeying through a realm of that level of consciousness and its correspondences and meanings, but even the art, the way the panels are designed, the borders along the panels, everything is being pointed towards conveying at least Moore's personal understanding through his own magical work and his own personal experiences of these realms. All right, so in particular, we see a focus on the relationship between the 10th Sephira Malkuth and the 9th Sephira Yesod, which we've already mentioned here. I think when we were talking about Moore's ontology, for Moore, Yesod represents the imagination, which is a slightly idiosyncratic interpretation. That's not something you'll see in all accounts of the Tree of Life and the distribution of the different powers and faculties of the human mind and consciousness throughout the tree, but that's the version that he's working with here. So the 9th Sephira Yesod, attributed to the moon, it represents that realm of imagination, the shared idea space, connected to the physical realm of Malkuth and the elements by the 32nd path. And so the movement both up and down the 32nd path will become really the core idea or movement or transformation throughout the series. And we'll come back to this. All right, so here she's journeying up the 32nd path, and she meets a symbolic figure here, and I think we just can look at it as an example of how these different realms are portrayed throughout the comic. So Sophie encounters this figure here who says, "Oh, I'm just an allegorical figure from a 16th century engraving. I've been sitting here near 500 years trying to figure out how this kite thing's supposed to work. I mean, seriously, this thing will never fly." And Promethea says, "That's the Tree of Life. I think the reason you're here is because the path you're holding it by is this one, Route 32, meaning like the 32nd path. They're given kind of like route, like road signs in the comic. So he's holding the Tree of Life by the 32nd path. And she says it symbolizes how this path helps mankind grasp the entire system, which, again, it is a slightly idiosyncratic way of understanding the 32nd path and the Tree of Life, but it's the way that Moore's working with it here. And I think it's legitimate. It's his own understanding, his own personal experience, and way of working with the set of symbols, which is important to understand. But yeah, again, just emphasizing the importance of that, the transition between Malkuth and Yesod, between the consciousness being rooted in the material physical world and then making the transition into the realm of the imagination itself is really the key in at least Moore's understanding of what the transformation represented by of magical consciousness and into a magical worldview, that being the most fundamental stage in that transformation. All right, so she travels up the 32nd path into the 9th Sephira of Yesod. And so we get dialogue between, let's see, in the panel on the left, that's Sophie Promethea in the foreground, and the previous Promethea, Barbara, in the background. So Barbara says, "What's this mean, Yesod, over the archway?" And Sophie says, "It's a Hebrew word meaning foundation. I guess it implies that spirituality is founded on imagination." And then a figure that they're meeting in this landscape says, naturally, before journeying to higher spheres, man must first reach the moon. From here, armed with imagination's vision, man need only look up." And then in the lower right panel there, we can see Promethea is now looking up. So she's standing on the 9th Sephira, looking up at the rest of the Tree of Life. So we see the orange sphere with the glyph of Mercury there, that's Sephira 8, Hod. The green with the Venus glyph there, that's Sephira 7, Netzach. And then all the other Sephira above it. So if we flip back to our diagram of the Tree of Life there, we can see how from looking up from the 10th Sephira Malkuth, we only see the 9th, but once we reach the 9th, at least in this way of presenting things, we're able to look up and see the rest of it. So again, emphasizing the foundational foundational nature of that transformation up the 32nd path to Yesod, where then the rest of the realms of these deeper realms of experience open up. Let's see, also, while they're in Yesod, because Yesod corresponds with the moon, we get some elements of Steve Moore's, his friend who co-wrote the Bumper Book of Magic with him, some of his own personal path and his own experiences, where Steve Moore, in some ways, lived out the myth of Endymion, who was the lover of the moon goddess, but who was only able to be with her in dreams. In some ways, that is kind of the mythic story that Steve Moore really lived out, and aspects of that story are incorporated into Promethea and into some other works as well. So let's see. So they encounter Endymion here. In the left, we get the dialogue. It's the shrine of Endymion here on the moon, exactly as I said it. Or this is the Roman satirist Lucian speaking. Lucian's also the one who wrote the rather satirical account of Alexander and Glycon. So Lucian's saying, "It's the shrine of Endymion here on the moon, exactly as I said it was in my true history. Endymion's a shepherd boy who loved the moon goddess Selene, yet could only be with her in eternal sleep and dream." Let's see, and then Sophie says, "Oh, he's beautiful." And then Barbara says, he's looking he's also sort of aroused looking. I guess he's dreaming about something nice." And Sophie says, "Wow, yeah, I guess so." And then Lucian says, "He's dreaming of Selene, asleep with his javelin in his hand, as I described him in my writings." And Lucian goes on to say, "It's Endymion's meaning that's important. Being with gods requires being in another state of consciousness. He also implies that Yesod governs sexual fantasy." So this will also connect with the presentation of sexual magic, and at least Moore's understanding of the importance of sexual magic in ritual work, which, as we said, sex magic has been a really important practice for 20th century magic. Most of that inspired through Aleister Crowley, though not limited to Crowley's ideas and presentations of that. But I think it's an interesting way of linking. Yesod is often associated with the genitals and with sexuality. The whole Tree of Life can be taken as a map of the human body, and Yesod corresponds with the genital center. So here we see this linking of the sexuality and the sexual force with imagination and the entrance into other states of consciousness through the Sephira Yesod. All right, so then after the 9th Sephira of Yesod, they journey up to the next Sephira up in the ordering. So this is the 8th Sephira of Hod, which is attributed to the planet Mercury, and particularly in this version of things here, Hod corresponds with, has the significance of language and image here. And we get a whole explanation given by, that's the god Hermes that we see there, sort of made of living quicksilver, guiding Sophie and Barbara throughout the realm and explaining to them this theory of the importance of language and image for the nature of the world and for gods. I think this is one of the best of the presentations of the Sephira throughout the series. This one feels like really strong and very inspired and particularly powerful. Some feel a little less inspired, some more, but this is definitely one of the more. So let's see. So Hermes is speaking here, and he says, let's see. They had just previously been sort of suddenly transplanted from one location to another within Hode. And he says, were we? Well, that doesn't matter here. It's all a story, isn't it? It's all fiction, all language. It can change like quicksilver. Quicksilver obviously being the substance, Mercury attributed to Hode and to the planet Mercury, obviously, which is what we see Hermes made out of living Mercury, living quicksilver. And then Sophie says, but this isn't fiction. This is our real life. And then Hermes says, haha, real life. Now there's a fiction for you. What's it made from? Memories, impressions, a sequence of pictures, a scattering of half-recalled words, disjointed hieroglyphic comic strips, unwinding in our recollection, language. So on the one hand, we have the presentation of what is More's theory or philosophy about language and image and consciousness, that creates life and shapes the world. But we also have the beginning of some breaking of the fourth wall here, where this comparison of life to disjointed hieroglyphic comic strips. We're obviously supposed to become aware that we are reading a comic strip here, and that there's some kind of analogy being made between comic strips and our actual lives that we experience. And the role of language and image in both of those things, obviously. Let's see. So a little bit later, Hermes says, do you see mathematics as a language, a human invention, a fiction, and yet it creates such elegant form. It creates splendor. It creates truth. Splendor is the English interpretation or English translation, of the Hebrew word hod. Language creates splendor. It creates truth. And then Barbara says, so everything's made from language. We're made of language, even you. And Hermes says, oh, especially me. How could humans perceive gods, abstract essences, without clothing them in imagery, stories, pictures, or picture stories for that matter? So we're getting here another very presentation of the same philosophy that we saw Glycon extol in that issue, that comic Grandeur and Monstrosity that we looked at in the first part. And I don't know if that was obvious or not, but the title of that comic, Grandeur and Monstrosity, that's part of the line from Hell, that core statement about the one place that the gods inarguably exist is in the human mind. That line includes the phrase grandeur and monstrosity. So just really linking together this whole sequence and again binding the whole project that Moore is engaged in. I think that seeing it as a kind of coherent whole, which is what I was hoping to draw out in the first part of the video of by looking at the way that the stages of this project and the different elements of it correspond to the quarters of the Saturn cycle of from Aquarius and returning again. Let's see. Anyways, so Hermes is saying that that the gods are abstract essences that have to be clothed in imagery, stories, pictures, or picture stories, right? Which obviously is supposed to be comic books here. And then Sophie says picture stories. And Hermes says, oh, hieroglyphics, face paintings, whatever did you think I meant? Besides, what could be more appropriate than for a language god to manifest through the original pictographic form of language? And Sophie says, what are you saying? And Hermes says, what am I saying? I'm saying some fictions might have a real god hiding beneath the surface of the page. I'm saying some fictions might be alive. That's what I'm saying, right? And obviously Hermes is turning to look out of the panel at us here, which, I think if we've bought into some of that, this idea about how gods can only exist in images, in words, or in theatrical presentations, like links together, like Alexander's presentations of Glycon, with Moore's, performance work that we saw with the recordings there. Right, there's something there's something magical happening here, at least if it's working for the reader, that this isn't just a representation of a god is a god, right? And so with the fourth wall breaking here, and Hermes directly addressing us, is obviously supposed to provoke the experience or the sudden kind of doubt about this being just a fiction or just language or images or just a comic book representation of a god, but perhaps the experience of actually encountering something through this medium here. All right, so let's just keep moving along here. We're not going to go through all of the Sephiroth. It would take way too much time. So from the 8th, we journey up the rest in order. As I said, I think some of these are more powerful than others. But they're all interesting. For those of you who have already studied Hermetic Qabalah and ceremonial magic, some of the presentations are a little unconventional. In particular, the 7th Sephira of Netzach, which is often understood, like in the Golden Dawn tradition, to correspond to the element of fire. So it's the planet Venus, but also the element of fire. So there's often emphasis on the sort of fiery nature of desire, and not will in the higher sense of like true will, but the willpower and the fiery nature of desire and passion. More presents Netzach as much more watery and oceanic, and really emphasizes like the green, the colors here, which is again an atypical sort of presentation. So often, like the 7th Sephira would correspond to the elemental weapon of the wand, which is the implement of fire. But yeah, the 7th, the presentation here really presents it in a watery sort of fashion. So just something to be aware of if you're reading it, that some of these things are a bit atypical. But I think they work in their context, and are obviously a presentation of Moore's personal understanding of these things. All right, so skipping all the way, or almost all the way up the tree here, in between the 4th and the 3rd, as we said, is this false Sephira of Da'ath, which is also the abyss, and the crossing of the abyss, which is, at least, like this is Aleister Crowley's understanding of the abyss as the gap or the separation between like the finite and the infinite, between the mortal and the divine, even between existence and the idea that the top three, the supernal triad, the top three Sephiroth are in some sense beyond existence, or that the distinction between existence and non-existence no longer really holds there. And so Da'ath and the abyss are the kind of gap or space that separates these two realms of the existence and non-existence, or the finite and the infinite. So in this issue of the comic, there's an interesting speculation about the proper numbering of the Sephira Da'ath. In Hermetic Kabbalistic sources, first of all, when Da'ath is really included in the system at all, which is not always or even usually, and when Da'ath is given a number, that number is typically 11, which, because like basically falling out of the Pythagorean tradition, the decad, the set of numbers from 1 to 10, when considered in their esoteric, symbolic, metaphysical, cosmological significance, represent the totality of everything that is or ever could be, all the way from the divine unity, the divine source, all the way down to all the aspects of the material cosmos. Da'ath is false or illusory, or a product of a misapprehension of part of the cosmos when viewed from a certain limited or incorrect perspective. So it's given the number 11 as something that doesn't genuinely map out a genuine part of existence, but is just an illusory thing. That's a much more complicated issue, really, but I'm sort of oversimplifying here for our purposes. But here in the comic, they speculate that the number of Da'ath could be the number pi, the ratio of the circumference to the diameter of a circle, 3.14159, et cetera, et cetera. which I think is a really interesting speculation, but possibly more interesting than what the comic itself realizes. Here, I think the explanation for that is just that it's a number greater than 3 but less than 4 that is irrational, that in this non-terminating, non-repeating decimal, there is something abyssal about that it just goes on forever without any kind of like pattern or structure to it, and that it can't be represented as an irrational number is a number that can't be represented as the ratio of 2 integers, and that there's something abyssal about that quality, which that's I think all fine logic. The problem is just that there is an infinity, and actually an uncountable infinity of irrational numbers that are greater than 3 but less than 4. There's no reason to choose pi among them all. But I think there actually is, or could be, a good argument for this, that because pi is the ratio of the circumference to the diameter of a circle, we can connect it to the ancient problem of the squaring of the circle, where basically the problem is given a circle, using only a ruler and compass, construct a square of equal area. And so this problem, which mathematicians worked on all the way from the ancient world, ancient Greece, into the modern times, especially in the Renaissance, like with Nicholas of Cusa and Giordano Bruno, this became a kind of metaphor for relating the divine to the mortal, the infinite to the finite, so that the circle represents the divine and the infinite, and then the square is the mortal and finite. But what was eventually, there's a problem that continued to vex mathematicians for centuries after centuries, until eventually in the, I believe it was late 19th century, eventually it was showed that it's not possible to do this in a finite number of steps, that because pi is a special type of irrational number, a transcendental number, it's simply not possible to construct it in that way. And I think that could be an interesting way of talking about why there is an abyss and why there is a gap there. Sometimes I feel a little bit uncomfortable with the idea of the abyss, that there's somehow, the divine is up there and distant from us, and we're here below the abyss. It feels a bit sort of Judeo-Christian, monotheistic to me, but I think that sort of mathematical explanation gives some kind of justification for it, and that there has to be some kind of a leap beyond that limitation of what mathematics and reason is able to achieve. So anyways, I just think that's an interesting speculation, and more interesting than the comic itself seems to be aware of. Anyways, here, so this is a particularly complex issue, and Moore is drawing from a number of different authors, as I said, from Crowley, from Kenneth Grant, and we also meet Austin Osman Spare here as well. A different version of, one thing that's sort of interesting is that some departed magicians like Aleister Crowley and John Dee, different aspects of them are met in different parts of the tree. So in the 8th Sephira, we had met actually all 3 of them, Spare and Dee and Crowley, but more as mortal magicians. And then as we go up the tree, we meet higher and more like exalted aspects of their personality. And so we meet a version of Austin Osman Spare here in Da'ath. And as I said, we mentioned Austin Osman Spare in our previous video on the musical group Coil, and we'll do a whole episode about Spare later on in this series, because he's definitely a very important, a wonderful artist and an important modern magical thinker as well. So let's see, Barbara says, Austin Spare, it's you. God, you're so much younger. You look beautiful. And Spare says, of this I know nothing. Of this nothing may be said. Let's see. Then skipping ahead a little bit, so he says, can you tell us where we are? And Spare says, we are not in non-existence, neither are we in that existence which is God, neither that which is not God. This is the Tower of the Adepts, the Black Brothers, and it is at Da'ath. No light is here admitted. And then they go on to speculate that if Da'ath means knowledge, it's a kind of knowledge that is beyond sense. So I don't know, just think an interesting presentation of some of the ideas here, and also this idea of neither, which we'll talk about when we do a whole video on spare. I think it's interesting to link that concept from spares, the like Zoskia philosophy of spares, to try to make this connection between that idea and this place on the Tree of Life. I don't know, we would want to push that too far, but I think it's an interesting connection that Moore is trying to make of bringing in like spares ideas into the Hermetic Qabalah and the understanding of this, the most strange of the Sephirah. All right, so we'll spend a little more time on the supernal triad, the first, second, and third of the Sephiroth. So let's see, I've got it kind of arranged as we see in the diagram of the Tree of Life. So on the left, we have the third Sephirah, Binah, which means understanding. On the right, the second Sephirah, Hokmah, meaning wisdom. And then in the center, the first and highest of the Sephiroth, Kether, which means crown. So the Binah here and in the Hermetic Qabalah more generally, Binah is understood as the realm of the divine feminine, where Hokmah is the divine masculine. So we have a dyad of masculine and feminine between the second and third. And then their union in Kether is most directly like existence itself or being itself, or the Godhead. But we also get the idea here, as well as in other Hermetic Kabbalistic works, that this is the realm of where male and female are united into the divine hermaphrodite, or drawing from alchemy, that image of the alchemical androgyne, the union of the red king and the white queen are united together in a being that that transcends the duality of gender. Which is a complicated idea, especially I think from a modern and contemporary perspective. That's definitely something we can talk about in a future video. I don't want to spend the time to do it now. Let's see. We also get the idea here that the elemental weapons of the cup and the wand, that we talked about in the first part of this video, in their highest sense, also correspond to Binah and Hokmah. So the cup or the grail corresponds to Binah, and then the wand to Hokmah. I think somewhat more typically, the grail and more typically like the lance would correspond to Hokmah in a lot of like Hermetic Kabbalistic ideas, rather than the four like elemental weapons of wand, cup, sword, and disc. Though I think several different things are being somewhat like equated here, because the suits of the tarot, like wands and cups, can be sort of attributed to the second and third Sephiroth, though that's kind of a complicated thing. So that we have a little bit of simplification going on here, but it's important for some of the symbolism that we see in the comic. Now, not in Promethea, but in the Moon and Serpent bumper book and some of the later stuff, we also get the idea that the Moon and Serpent, right, the Moon being like Selene, Steve Moore's patron deity, the Moon goddess, and the Serpent, right, of the Moon and Serpent, the Serpent being Glycon, that they could actually be understood as Hokmah and Binah, as this pairing of the two highest powers, below the absolute Godhead itself, which is something they didn't consciously plan, when they were choosing those deities, or when they named their project, the Moon and Serpent Grand Egyptian Theater of Marvels, but later came to understand that pairing of the Moon and Serpent could be understood to have this higher significance, but that's not directly here in Promethea yet. All right, so in the third Sephirah, Binah, which is attributed to Saturn, though there's also a kind of secondary attribution of Binah to the moon in the highest sense, where Yesod is the moon in the more, sort of typical astrological sense. The idea of the Binah as is this exalted form of the moon, and Chokmah as an exalted form of the sun, and sun and moon forming another sort of variation on the alchemical, the alchemical king and queen. So we get some of that lunar, exalted lunar sort of symbolism here as well, in addition to the planet Saturn. So again, as we said, representing the divine feminine, really presented here as the womb of creation, that as Binah sort of takes in the energy being admitted by Chokmah, this sphere sort of pregnancy becomes like pregnant with existence, and then gives birth to all the lower Sephiroth that exist below the tree. That's an idea that we get played out here in this essentially like not sex magic, but sex mysticism. The idea of the cosmogenesis and the creation of all of existence as a sexual union between this polarized divine pair or divine couple. Which, drawing on Thelemic mythology, is represented as the goddess Babylon that we see here in this image, who corresponds with Binah and is associated with that sphere, and then the beast that we can see here, the seven-headed beast drawn from Revelations, which, Babylon, of course, is also drawn from Revelation, the whore of Babylon, who is herself a kind of degraded version of, or in its biblical context, is a degraded version of Mesopotamian goddesses like Inanna. Though that's a complicated thing that we're not going to fully deal with here. In this particular issue, we also get a kind of equation of Babylon with the Virgin Mary, from Christian mythology, which almost presenting them as like two aspects or faces of the same being, which I don't think really fully works. I don't know. I suppose it's an interesting idea. It is sort of non-typical. That's not a typical understanding of Babylon, but they try to work with it. They try to work with it here. But I think the presentation of Babylon here in this comic is really rather nice, and certainly better than a lot of her portrayals, avoiding what the magical writer Nema calls pin-up Babylon, the presentation of her as just sort of little more than like an object for, a kind of male, an object for male fantasy, but presenting her as an agent, even in her more terrifying and devouring sort of aspects, but as a goddess, a dignified being, certainly. I don't want to dwell on that. We'll definitely talk about that in some future videos for sure. All right, and it's also in her travel through Binah and her experience here that Promethea Sophie Promethea is given her understanding of her role in bringing in the apocalypse and what that means and its significance. So let's see. This is just a few excerpts from a longer text here, but we can just read through some of it, and then I'll make some comments. So this is Babylon, speaking to Sophie Promethea, and so she says, "Yet it is that understanding by another means decanted also, as a fiery mead of spirit does it flow, that is not in its downward path corrupted. Fire of heaven is this nectar, that not in earth be soiled nor quenched. A burning moon foam, then shall this true blood, this sangral, be carried down upon a mighty chariot." The chariot here is an image drawn from the tarot, and the chariot corresponds to the path that connects Binah to the fifth Sephirah of Gevurah. So we have the image of this burning moon foam, which is a really good kind of paradoxical, surreal sort of image of a burning foam, a burning fluid, and a kind of fiery liquid. I think is a nice image, and this like flowing downwards, like down the tree, and towards existence. So continuing on here, in its red vintage is distilled the moment of my dreadful understanding, unexpressed that comes privately in dark and silence, that is called apocalypse. So understanding is the English translation of the Hebrew word Banah, the name of this Sephirah, and reaching here to the etymology of the word apocalypse, which literally means revelation. Of course, it also has that significance of end of the world, but it is most fundamentally a revelation or a moment of awakening, and we'll see that really played out in the apocalypse that takes place in the rest of the comic series. All right, and then she continues and says, and is that child become a tale that strikes fire in the heart? And is that fire become a blaze, where in thy time man's world must be consumed? And then the characters here are all in a kind of like psychic sort of communion, because here above the abyss, the notion of individuality doesn't really hold. So they are, all their minds are all kind of in communion with each other. And so this is like Barbara's mind stream kind of coming in here and saying, in thy name, talking to Sophie, then you're the Promethea who oversees the end of the world's end, right? So this is her realization that she's to oversee, the apocalypse and the end of the world here, and some of the significance of that event. All right, so moving along to the second highest Sephirah Hokmah, which means wisdom, and it corresponds beyond any of the planetary spheres, either to the zodiac specifically or to the all of the stars. That in classical understanding, like the sphere of the fixed stars that was believed to be outside of the sphere of Saturn, but beyond the planetary existence. And corresponding here with the divine masculine and with the logos, the creative word or the kind of reason that informs and is at least the potential structure of things that has to be incubated in the womb of Banah before being birthed into existence. So here in Hokmah, they see a scene of the god Pan having sex with Selene, the moon goddess. And then Barbara and Sophie are discussing the significance of this mythic image. And so Sophie says, it's like Babylon riding the beast, the celestial goddess and the chaotic animal force. It's the primal scene. It's mom and dad doing it, humping toward the moment of conception. But it's the conception of the universe. All the male and female energies pounding in the binary throb of being, on and off, back and forth, in and out. Gravity, electromagnetism, the weak nuclear force, the strong nuclear force, earth, air, water, fire, this phosphorus angel copulation. So again, expressing that, this idea of a kind of sexual cosmogenesis of seeing the world as the product of this kind of divine sexual act. Let's see, continuing on a little later in this particular issue, there's some more discussion of Promethea's role in bringing about the apocalypse here. She says, I was just thinking about what I learned at Banah, me presiding over the apocalypse. This is it, isn't it? Revelation, this heavenly light. This is what everything begins in. This is what everything ends in. This humming prismatic radiance. But on an earthly plane, I mean, it's going to be terrifying. And then Barbara says, this illumination, the moment when the lights go on. So again, this idea of apocalypse as revelation, as awakening, as the disclosure of the divine reality and the reality of this immaterial realm and its cosmic significance here. But also the revelation that, as we'll talk about, that this apocalypse will not be, received well by a lot of the population, that this will be seen as a threatening, destructive force by those who don't understand what it is. All right, and then finally, they journey into the highest Sephirah, Kether, the crown, which Kether essentially has no real properties. It's divinity, it's being. It is as oneness and non-distinction, sort of in and of itself. There's really very little that can be said about it. But that being the case, I think they actually do a good job of getting a whole issue of a comic book, or nearly the end of it portrays their journey like back down and into the world, but getting a substantial amount of content out of an idea that is so simple that is almost impossible to actually talk about or portray. But here they really emphasize the idea of unity and a kind of universal unity, that everything is one, that all times and places and people, everything exists as a kind of single divine moment, and that all are united, and emphasizing, as we talked about, the significance of love in a kind of universal, cosmic, like divine love as part of the highest mystical understanding. So let's see. Barbara says, yes, here we are again, and we are each other, and we are God. Yes, and God is one, and one is next to nothing, this sacred, blissful whiteness. So yeah, they're having now a pinnacle, mystical experience of realizing, the unity of all beings and things, and the unity with the divine. All right, so let's move on and talk about the apocalypse, which is the event that really concerns the final 5 or 6 sort of issues of the comic, and brings the various like threads and everything to a conclusion, and as I said, also brings the entire like America's Best Comics to an end here. So after returning from the tree and understanding her role in bringing the apocalypse, there's a few other sort of problems that she has to deal with first, but then in understanding her role in bringing about the end of the world, Sophie becomes frightened by this. She also has even more enemies now, as the various superheroes that inhabit the America's Best Comics sort of universe understand that that's what she's going to do, that she's going to end the world or bring about the apocalypse. They do, what superheroes always do, and try to prevent the end of the world, try to prevent the apocalypse, which I think is a really nice twist here that, again, that's such a classic superhero thing to do, to stop, some mad supervillain or whatever from destroying the world. But here we are on the side of the apocalypse and on the side of the world being destroyed, because we, in going through this journey up the tree of life and the various revelations that happen in that journey, understand what that actually means and the actual significance of it, and also the need for the world to be transformed. So let's see. In this panel that we see here, so Sophie has at least temporarily renounced her role as Promethea. She refuses to become Promethea and actually flees to another city and attempts to basically just live an ordinary mortal life. She works in a video store, and in this sequence here, she had been hanging out with her boyfriend and a friend of theirs, and they get stoned. And then in this altered state of consciousness, one of the other Prometheas is able to, from the immateria, is able to come through, because of her stoned state, and speak directly to her. So this other Prometheus says, "Mistress Sophie, we would all soonest you return and shoulder once again your fearsome task." So urging her to carry on with the work. Some of the other dialogue here is the conversation that her boyfriend and their friend is having, because they of course can't see this other Promethea that's appeared on the couch with them. They're not aware of this, what's happening. And then the other Promethea says here, "Mistress Bill," who's yet another one of the Promethea incarnations. "Mistress Bill asks that you watch the news more and say to tell you this is not a drill." So I think this is really interesting, and again touches on some of the political and social dimensions of this whole thing, that when she comes through and is able to communicate to Sophie, the thing that she urges her to do is to watch the news. And so throughout these later comics, we get a bunch of reflections of what was at that time current events, right? I mean, Promethea began in 1999 and then finishes up in 2005. So partway through the run, we get the September 11th attacks and their aftermath, right? The war on terror and the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, and we see elements of that like reflected in the story. And here, I think this is just really. And when we do see bits of news and things like that in the world, a lot of them reflect the wars on terror and the wars in the Middle East here, and that this being what the other Prometheas from the Immateria urge Sophie to do is to watch the news, as if to say that by watching the news she will understand the need to end the world, that that the U.S. actions in the Middle East are something like the ultimate example, at least at that particular moment in time, of the world that needs to be ended, that the apocalypse is the end of that regime of of reality based on war and violence and domination, and that is the world that needs to be destroyed by fire. That's what Promethea ultimately aims to do, and that the revelation of the nature of the imagination and the divinity and human nature and even the mystical sense of love and connectedness and everything else, that those things are antithetical and ultimately destructive of the kind of mindset that leads to imperialism and war and all the forms of oppression and restriction and so on. All right, so in the actual events that end up bringing on the apocalypse, after eventually, of course, Sophie, the various superheroes like find Sophie and she's forced to transform into Promethea, and that kicks off these sort of sequence of events that brings in the apocalypse. We have this strange sort of sequence that I really didn't get like the first time that I read through the comic, or I didn't understand why it was happening, where the actual event that really triggers the final apocalypse is Sophie's mom putting a swizzle stick into a glass. Various characters have like the visions of this glass and some presentiment of this moment. It is kind of an odd sort of idea, but I think the idea is that as the immaterial comes through, an ordinary action like putting a swizzle stick into a drink becomes imbued with symbolic and spiritual and even like cosmic significance, so that this insertion of the stick into the glass is like the union of the wand and the cup, which we already saw is connected to Hokmah and Binah, the highest two forces there, and is also connected to sexuality. We see, we haven't mentioned him, but there's a character named Jack Faust, who is a magician, who is Sophie's mentor in magic and her studies of magic and Qabalah. And in the issue of sex magic, Faust and Promethea have sex, and he sort of teaches her that it functions as a kind of instruction in sexual magic. And so in that we see their sexual act as being equated with the plunging of the wand into the cup, and now this echoes again into the putting of the swizzle stick into the glass here, which brings in the apocalypse. But I think the idea that's at least trying to come through is that these sort of very ordinary, like mundane actions from a magical state of consciousness can be imbued with magical, symbolic, even sort of like cosmic levels of significance. All right, and then right after she's done this, the reality begins to transform, and then Sophie Promethea says, "Mom, it's okay," because her mom starts to freak out a bit. You put the wand into the Grail. And then the mother, now starting to have her consciousness transformed, says, "Oh God, Sophie, I'm real. My life is real. It's really happening to me. This is now," right? So this is her experiencing this kind of spiritual awakening and revelation, where the veil of the ordinary and the mundane is being lifted to reveal the divine reality beneath. Let's see. So then Sophie Promethea is talking to Jack Faust, and she says, Jack, this feels like the immateria, right? So the immateria, that realm of the imagination and consciousness, is now fully like crossing into and overlapping with the material world. And so Jack says, it's getting closer, the moment when everybody's consciousness shifts from the earthly plane to the higher spheres above. We're nearly there. The big 32, the grand finale, the material world's end. The opening of this 30-second path is almost here, Sophie, and we're all coming along on this one. This way of using the tree that Moore is working with here. So the big 32, that he's referring to here, that everything's come down the tree. Again, we saw that with Babylon, the idea of the pouring out of her, this sort of burning moon foam, the blood and the wine from her grail, sort of down the tree and into the world. And so now we have the crossing of the 30-second path downward, whereas in her journey, Sophie Promethea had crossed it going upwards. Now the apocalypse is happening by the end of the material world, or the illusion of the merely material world is being ended by it being crossed in the other direction, that these spiritual forces that had been repressed, buried, or simply unacknowledged are now coming down the 30-second path and directly impinging on Malkuth and the material world. So as this happens, the material reality is transformed in this sort of marvelous state. All the kinds of beings and the type of imagery, obviously very psychedelic sort of imagery that we've seen in the Immateria, is now inhabiting the material world. And we see various people, characters throughout the series, the different superheroes, as well as some political figures. There's a character there that's obviously George Bush, encountering this new reality and showing the ways that some reject it, some are terrified by it, some, like the children, we can see here in the middle of the panel, being, enchanted and excited by it, some having revelations, some experiencing fear and terror, which I think the presentation of this is very obviously influenced by the psychedelic experience. In some ways, it's almost as if, the whole world suddenly begins to trip simultaneously. And, some people have bad trips. Others have, other kinds of trips that I think that's a way of thinking for more anyways, that experience and the different reactions that can happen and the different types of experiences and understandings that can come from that experience as a way of thinking about what a sort of global transformation of magical consciousness might be like. It's a doorway into thinking about that concept. So again, touching on some of the sort of political and social sort of themes here. We have here a group of U.S. Army officers who have just gotten word that they need. So the event that triggers the apocalypse begins in Manhattan and starts to spread out into the rest of the world. And so they have, the U.S. Military command has decided to use nuclear weapons to destroy Manhattan to attempt to stop this process. But the various soldiers or officers, whatever, here, as these events start to happen and they begin to have their consciousnesses transformed and they begin to awaken, they refuse to carry out their orders here, which again I think taps into some of that sense of the political, social, reality here, and also the sense that the United States military is the sort of ultimate example of the world that needs to be ended, and that as these soldiers have their consciousness transformed, they refuse to comply with orders. We also have the children of the temple that we saw much earlier, who are actually moved into the Immateria for a while because of the temple leaders breaking their word. But now they return back into the world, and they're talking to the leader of the temple there and his wife. And so she says, "Oh God, Henry, it's them. They're alive, right? Their children had been taken away from them, and they presumed that they were dead." She said, "Oh God, Henry, it's them. They're alive." And he says, "But where have you all been?" And the little girl says, "We've been with the Pied Piper, and now he's brought us back to boss you around." And then the boy says, "He didn't say that. We're supposed to help people get used to things." So they return to the world. This idea that children, I think, are able to intuitively understand, the nature of the imagination and its power, are actually here to help guide the adults who are, the leaders of the temple here are shown being terrified by the experiences of the apocalypse and thrown into despair. But their own children come back who understand, the nature of imagination and its power, and are able to help guide them into a new understanding. let's see. So then he says, used to things, and the little girl says, yes, like all our clocks being wrong and all the dead people being still here, really. The part of this event is the dead returning to the world. And she says, come on, we'll show you. The lady is going to talk to everybody. All right, so now we have in the sort of final sequence, Promethea, essentially the idea is that this is happening. Promethea is addressing like each and every person in the world, but we experience, the reader sort of experiences this kind of like in first person. So we get another sort of fourth wall breaking thing where Promethea essentially is directly addressing the reader and has become aware that she is, is a character in a story, but that, yeah. Let's see, let's just read the dialogue here. So she says, okay, now listen to me. Yes, Promethea's fiction. Nobody ever claimed otherwise. I never lied. I'm at least an honest fiction, a true fiction, a fiction that can enter your dreams, possess her creators, talk to them, talk through them to you. I'm an idea, but I'm a real idea. So, right, there's also this expression of the idea that the Promethea entity isn't just a fiction that Moore and J.H. Williams III, the primary artist here, have created, that we get this sort of short-circuiting of the themes of the comic and the actual creation of the comic itself, which again we saw in the issue of Hode, where Hermes sort of breaks the fourth wall, and we also saw in that issue Grandeur and Monstrosity, where Glycon does largely the same thing, by directly referring to the artificial, like constructed nature of the medium. You're able to get a strange sort of short-circuiting where the figure is able to kind of cross over into the world in some sense, which is obviously an effect that I think is a kind of simulation, or not even simulation, but is in some sense a magical act, I think, for Moore and his understanding of art and magic, that in this moment, we almost experience that same thing that is the apocalyptic revelation, that here, like, imagination crosses over into the material, that that by a fiction becoming aware of the fact that it's a fiction, by Glycon becoming aware of his own nature as a hoax, and yet inspired by or clothing or the appearance of a real idea, or real living, like, divine idea. Something in Moore's understanding, something I think genuinely magical was happening here, and transforms Promethea into being a comic about magic, and into a comic that is actually an attempt to work magic, and is a magical working in itself. Which resonates with a lot of themes we'll be talking about all throughout the series. We talked about that last time with Coil, where, it's music that isn't just like about magic or contains, magical or esoteric imagery, but are actually magical workings themselves, and our attempt to transform, the listener or here the reader, to transform their consciousness and to actually work magic in the world, which in Moore's language here is like the attempt to cross the 30-second path, to bring the reality of what here is called the immateria, like, into the world, and to have people able to experience that, and to have their consciousness and their understanding of the world transformed thereby. So in the panel on the right here, Prometheus says, I'm the idea of the human imagination, which, when you think about it, is the only thing we can really be certain isn't imaginary, which is a nice kind of almost paradoxical insight there. All right, so then we get a sequence of pages and these kind of large, like, double-page spreads that we see all throughout the whole series, where we have a presentation of really Alan Moore's basic magical worldview, a lot of the same things that we've been talking about throughout the comic, though here expressed in a very poetic sort of way, and accompanied by some very psychedelic, sacred, and magical imagery and artwork here. I think touching on a lot of the same themes that we later get presented in a more non-fictional sort of style in the Bumper Book of Magic. I think that the presentation of it within the story and its combination of poetry and art here actually makes Promethea a lot more powerful and inspiring than the more literal sort of non-fictional presentation in the Bumper Book is. But at the same time, I think the bumper book goes through in a lot more specific detail what in Promethea is expressed through image and poetry and suggestion and sort of evoking ideas rather than stating them directly. So they can also work quite nicely together. The bumper book could almost serve as like a key to understanding what's happening throughout Promethea. So yeah, just zooming in on the kind of upper right-hand corner of the previous image that we saw here, just looking at a little bit of Promethea's dialogue here, and her revelation, her addressing us with her revelation. And she says, "This then is revelation. All is one and all is deity, this beautiful undying fire of being that is everywhere about us, that we are. O man, O woman, know yourself and know you are divine. Respect yourself, respect the least phenomenon of your existence as it were the breath of God." And then continuing on, as the vision fades out, she says, "Rejoice, your world is ended. The beliefs whereupon it was founded turned to air before the quantum scrutiny of your new science were never truly there. Time's jail yards are unlocked, the prison of material ambition that reduced you now demolished." Again, touching on some of those political and social themes, and more zone, anarchist politics being connected here to this magical revelation. She says, "Rejoice, return now to your separate moments, selves, and rooms, and know that separation for illusion. Know that you were one, were here, and in eternity are here forever. Here, where sudden firelight in your soul startled you from your worldly slumber. Stay awake." So now we have the sort of the come down from the high of the trip and the return into the material world. And so we get a kind of coda or sort of epilogue here where after the end of the world, things aren't immediately transformed. And although some people have begun to take up the message. So this is Sophie here, who's no longer Promethea speaking. And she says, "Everybody had the revelation, but not everybody understood it or took any notice of it. Though maybe enough people did. Things are changing." And this character who used to be an antagonist, who used to be an FBI agent that was chasing her before the apocalypse, he says, "Maybe you aren't sure." And she says, "Hey, I'm just Sophie. I'm not Promethea anymore." So we get this sort of reintegration into the world. And in a way, it's nice that not everything is solved sort of all at once, that even though so many people all over the world have had this experience, it doesn't solve everything overnight, which I think is sort of a nice way of ending things and maybe circumventing the sort of too easy fantasy that a single apocalyptic event could sort of fix all of our problems all at once, but that even if that sort of revelation came, there would still be all sorts of work to do and all sorts of problems to solve. The sort of the morning after, whether the revolution or a psychedelic or magical experience, there's still that work of laboring and changing and integrating. All right, so that wraps up what I wanted to say about Promethea. As I said, it's an incredibly dense comic with a lot of ideas and storylines. A lot of it, a lot of the stories and things like that are in the various character arcs and narratives are fairly easy to follow. I think that it's some of the broader significance of the magical ideas is the more challenging part, but hopefully drawing out. I hope this video has been helpful for your own sort of deeper understanding of that comic or your own journey into it. Again, I think it's really the center of, and remains, for me anyways, the most powerful presentation of really all of the ideas that we've talked about throughout this series. Although, as I've said, I think it has some limitations. There's some ideas that I'm a little bit critical of. I think it remains an important and beautiful work, and it's certainly personally important to me. I read it fairly early on in my journey into magical and esoteric practice, and it was definitely an important point of inspiration for sure, and it remains close to my heart, absolutely. And I hope that it could be seen as, or I would encourage people to see it as the kind of central artifact in a way of Alan Moore's magical works. I think I think it is the most powerful. I would also encourage people to spend some time with the spoken word performances too. I think there's a lot there. I think those are also a really powerful presentation, and I think that format works quite nicely with Moore's sometimes like florid, kind of excessive sort of prose style. I think that being maybe both accompanied by music and given the sort of limitations of the performance and the recording format, I think it works rather nicely. In the same way that I think his again, as we talked about, I think his most powerful works have always been collaborations, and that his words and his stories are most effective when he's collaborating either with musicians or with artists or other writers. Anyways, just to cap off this video, I just wanted to mention that apocalyptic, this sense of an apocalypse that involves the crossing of the boundary between the two worlds, between the material, physical, mundane world and the realm of consciousness and imagination, and fictions and angels and demons and deities and everything else, as well as fictional characters. That is an idea that recurs several times. It happens again in the comic Providence, which we will at least briefly mention in a later video in this series when we talk about H.P. Lovecraft and the Necronomicon and the concept of like hyperstition. We'll come back to the theme of apocalypse in Moore's work, at least briefly when we do that video. But I also just wanted to mention here another version of this same sort of idea, and one of the last, I think, presentations of it, and also Moore's last comic book, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. All right, so League of Extraordinary Gentlemen was a collaboration between Alan Moore and the artist Kevin O'Neill that spanned, I think, about 20 years, like from the late 90s until just before Kevin O'Neill's death, and I want to say 2018. I could be off by a year, but I think that's about right. So it's a huge, complex, kind of sprawling work that is basically impossible to summarize here. The basic idea is that it's set in a world where basically all fictional characters and places and whatever are all real. In fact, it's a world entirely populated by the characters from fiction. So, like in the original few books within the series, the main characters are like Nemo from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the Invisible Man, from the H.G. Wells book, Jekyll and Hyde, from the Robert Louis Stevenson book, Mina Murray or Mina Harker from Dracula, Orlando from Virginia Woolf, and so on. It ends up spanning all the way from the Victorian era, like into the modern world, and eventually into the future. But playing out a lot of Moore's sense of this imaginal space and the sort of agency or nature of fictional characters. There's not a whole lot of like explicitly esoteric content in there, although we do get a pretty funny version of Aleister Crowley, who's what's his name, Oliver Haddo, who's actually a kind of caricature of Aleister Crowley from a Somerset Maugham novel. So Moore has fun with this sort of caricature version of Aleister Crowley, who's a truly evil, like, black magician, who eventually sires basically Harry Potter. He can't actually name Harry Potter, obviously, because of copyright issues, but essentially sires Harry Potter as his moonchild, who's the Antichrist. Although Harry Potter is then defeated by Mary Poppins, which is pretty great. Okay, but in this world of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, it also contains a realm that's essentially equivalent to Promethea's Immateria, that's known here as the Blazing World. And so in the Blazing World, we meet the character Prospero, who is from Shakespeare's play The Tempest. And The Tempest we will come back to and talk about again when we do a video on the filmmaker Derek Jarman, because Jarman does a film version of The Tempest, and the figure of John Dee also appears in some other works of Jarman too. So there's a nice link here between some of Moore's work and some of Jarman's that we will, we'll come back and talk about again, which is one of the reasons I wanted to add this here. All right, so as I said, the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen spans like 20 years, and it's kind of interesting to watch the evolution of some of Moore's ideas, particularly as we get past when Promethea finished in 2005, and the way that his conception of that apocalypse really changes. In Promethea, I think there's something very like hopeful and positive and optimistic about the way that apocalypse happens there. There's a real sense of the possibility of the positive like transformation of the earth, that there could be awakening, that we could wake up to the true nature of reality, that we could that war could be ended and so on. There seems to be all that possibility, but and then the vision seems to get darker as the 21st century progresses. Certainly Providence is, being a Lovecraftian story, is an incredibly pessimistic version of it, though I think obviously because it's a Lovecraftian story, it doesn't really represent Moore's like true views. He's working within that genre, though again we'll come back and talk about Providence in a future video. But even here in the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, we can see this sort of shift to a maybe somewhat more pessimistic take on this same concept. So let's see, this is from a work within the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen called The Black Dossier that was published in 2007. And so here we meet this is the Prospero figure, the sort of equivalent to John Dee from Shakespeare, who within the blazing world, and we get this, the red-blue, whatever you call it, kind of stereo separation, because the things that happen in the blazing world are supposed to be viewed through 3D glasses. So that's why this image looks the way it does. And so Prospero here is giving a speech towards the end of the book here about the significance of the imagination and about narrative, touching on those same themes that we've already talked about quite a bit. Let's see. So we'll just read through what Prospero says here. Prospero always speaks in iambic pentameter here, right? Because he's taken from The Tempest. So he says, and more, the very personality that scries this epilogue was once unformed, assembled hastily from borrowed scraps, from traits admired in others, from ideals. Did fictional examples not prevail, Home's intellect, the might of Hercules, our virtues, our intoxicating vice, while fashioning thyself, were these not clay? If we mere insubstantial fancies be, how more so thee, who from us substance stole? So similar to a number of the characters in Promethea that we've already seen, Prospero is essentially now addressing us and saying that because we as individuals in the formation of our personalities, especially through like adolescence and as we grow up, we take bits and pieces of fictional characters and narratives and use those as the raw material to make our personalities and to understand ourselves and our roles in the world as series of models for character and life stories, with the paradoxical suggestion here that makes those fictional entities realer than we supposedly real material people actually are, because we are made out of them, which is I think a really nice variation on some of those same ideas that we've already talked about here. Let's see, and then continuing on to the second panel, Prospero says, not thou alone, but all humanity doth in its progress fable emulate. Whence came thy rocket ships and submarines, if not from Nautilus, from Cavorite? The Nautilus, of course, being Captain Nemo's ship, right? In Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, who was a character. He and his descendants are characters all throughout League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Also, continuing on here, he says, your trustiest companions since the cave, we apparitions guided mankind's tread, our planet, unseen counterpart to thine, as permanent, as venerable, as true. On dreams' foundation, matter's mud yards rest. Two sketching hands, each one the other draws. The fantasies thou fashioned fashion thee. The two sketching hands, that's obviously a reference to that famous M.C. Escher drawing of the two hands like drawing each other that I'm sure a lot of you have seen. And again, I think touching on some of these same things, but even here on Dream's foundation, matter's mud yards rest, we even hear that a Kabbalistic reference there, right, to foundation being the English translation of the word yesod, the ninth sephira, connected to the material by the 32nd path there. So again, some of that revisiting and re-expressing some of those ideas. And I think this idea that not just our own personalities, but also humanity's progress is based on narratives and fictions. I think it is a really powerful idea that, exploring space came from, visionaries like some of who were esotericists, like, Jack Parsons in the U.S. was a practicing magician, or what's his name, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky in Russia, was a sort of theosophist. But, reading the works of people like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells were huge inspirations to them and to other people who were involved in the early space program. And that, if it hadn't been for people like Wells and Verne, we might never have, gone into space and landed on the moon. Being a way of seeing the reality and power and even the sort of foundational nature of the imagination and story for all of human life, I think is a nice addition or extension of some of those same ideas that we saw in Promethea. All right, so here we have from the final installment of League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, The Tempest, the last installment that was published in 2018. This is Prospero again, wearing the red and green glasses there with the beard, it's been slowly revealed that he's been conspiring both with the fairies and with some Lovecraftian entities called the Loigor, drawn from a concept that I think a few different writers have used. And he's now revealing the full significance and aims of his apocalyptic plan. He's been working on both with Lovecraftian entities and with the fairies. We also have Gloriana here, who's the queen of the fairies and something of a sort of fairy version of Elizabeth I. So, Prospero as Dee's relationship to Gloriana, like Dee's, relationship to Elizabeth I. Prospero has this sort of relationship to Gloriana, the queen of the fairies. Let's see. So Prospero says, "Fair Gloriana, let me next display an earth transformed according to thy whim, with fairyland ascendant, while mankind takes its turn, cowering 'neath hedgerows drear. Civilization's end shall fit its crime, the fantasies it banished and repressed returned, dreams come true, their dreamers to devour, nightmares forgot in lost terrestrial youth. The unforgiving fictions are unleashed, figment and fable dire from every land, reality's fair shackles fall to dust as devastating legend slips its chain. No mere theater a new globe sees birth, and wondrous things shall tread once more the earth." And now we see all these, both fairies and monsters and these Lovecraftian beings beginning to cross the boundary and come into the world, much as in, what in Promethea was that apocalyptic crossing of the 32nd path. Here happens less as a revelation and a kind of optimistic, positive transformation of the earth, but a kind of return of the repressed, a revenge of all of the repressed fantasies or the humanity's inability to deal with its fantasies and its fictions in a mature, sophisticated way. I think we can hear a lot of essentially Moore's pessimism about the direction of human it seems to me, especially like Western culture here. In particular, I think he'd been something almost at war with superhero narratives throughout his entire career, all the way back into the 1980s, but seeing them not only continuing, but even revitalized and expanding, and the explosion of like Marvel cinematic, the universe, right? All these horrible sort of superhero films that we've been buried under for the last however many years now. And just feeling an incredible sense of pessimism with the direction of human culture. And this, I think this finale of League of Extraordinary Gentlemen be a very jaded sort of and more pessimistic version of the same sort of event where, again, instead of a revelation and a transformation of consciousness, it's rather a kind of revenge, civilization's end shall fit its crime, that because of our inability to deal properly with the realm of the imagination and the creatures that live there, and our sort of, that we remain in this sort of juvenile state, that, as Moore has talked about, that superheroes he sees are essentially a kind of both juvenile and fascistic fantasy, and that the transformation here can now only really be imagined as this sort of invasion. Anyways, I just wanted to include that. I think it's an interesting and somewhat dark follow-up from Promethea, but the inclusion of Lovecraftian entities here obviously touches on some of the things that we'll talk about later in the series when we talk about Lovecraft and mention Providence. And I also just really wanted to include this appearance of Prospero here because of the relation to Derek Jarman. And in some future series, I would want to focus on like modern, more or less contemporary culture, but we could absolutely talk about The Tempest as itself and a cultural work. It's just outside the scope of this particular series, but The Tempest is quite an interesting work, and even at the end of the Tempest, the Shakespeare's play, Prospero becomes something of a mouthpiece for Shakespeare, reflecting back on his career as a poet and dramatist, and even there in that last speech above Prospero in the play. We get some of that same idea of the artist and creator as magician, and art and theater as magic and as a kind of magical act that the audience, or almost like a ritual that the audience participates in. So I think that's an interesting link too, that Moore's idea of magic and art is being directly linked back to Shakespeare's ideas of these things, and the way that, but Shakespeare of course is also drawing on the real world magician John Dee and his actual magic. So we have this constant sort of crossing back and forth of the world of genuine magical practice and fictional presentations of it, and the continual sort of blurring of those lines, and their, some of this paradoxical, sometimes fourth wall breaking, sort of looping back and forth into each other, which is obviously a theme that, Moore has been extremely interested in, all the way through his career, and then really intensifying that with the sense that there's a magical and transformative dimension to that effect, and that there's something true in it too, that it expresses something real about our imagination and about human life and human civilization and culture, both its promise and potential and the beautiful things about it, as well as how it's also gone very, very wrong in recent times, and obviously all the catastrophes facing us now. That's something we can. This video has gone on quite long. I don't want to keep ranting about that, but that's certainly an idea that we can return to and talk about more. So so this has been quite a long video when you consider both parts together, certainly. Thanks for your patience. I hope this has been useful and interesting. Let's see, I'll be back hopefully in less time as there was between this video and the second with another video. I realized that there was, this theme of apocalypse I wanted to follow up on and continue thinking about. So for our next video in the series, I'm going to talk about the surrealist artist Leonora Carrington, and in particular her novel The Hearing Trumpet, which is one of my favorite novels. I really love it, and it presents something that I think has some interesting resonances with the apocalyptic themes here, but it is taken in an interesting direction and has some interesting dimensions to it. And yeah, I think that'll hopefully will be really interesting, and will add and build on some of the things that we've already talked about here, and yeah, continue to reflect on some of these themes. So thanks again for watching. As always, you can sort of like, subscribe, do all that stuff. Thanks for watching, and until next time, take care. Bye.